How's everyone's Thursday going? Good. Glad to hear it, Maddox. I mean, hard to complain with this morning. Unusual. What's up with you, huh? I think we left off on the Four Noble Truths on Tuesday. Does that sound right? Okay, well, hopefully we have a few more people joining us. I hope we're doing well this Thursday. For those of you who just joined us, this is Sophie. She apparently wants to hang out this morning. But so we are going to be finishing our introduction to Buddhism today. So we introduced the story of Siddhartha Gautama, and I forgot to tell you about the flowers, so definitely don't let me forget to tell you about the flowers today. And we will be wrapping up some of his major teachings before we introduce the three main branches that emerged from his teachings after his death. So it was quite a while after his death, but the remaining monks at the time got together and had a very, very big meeting, out of which came two primary branches, and then eventually a third split off from one of them. So we'll be getting into all of those traditions next week. But so we're just going to wrap up our introduction today. So any questions before I get started? Anything about Siddhartha Gautama's early life? We talked about his miraculous birth story. So I forgot to tell you the most miraculous part, but who can remember anything about his stories from Tuesday? Refresh our memories for us. Do you know? No. He was born into a privileged family, sheltered by his father, got married, and left his family to pursue religion. That is absolutely right. Okay, so he had, again, in terms of thinking of his philosophy as what is known as the middle way, right? We can see him as having lived both extremes prior to that, right? Growing up in a life of extreme privilege, leaving that to pursue a life of asceticism, A-S-C-E-T, right? That path of denial. So going from one extreme to the other, right? And then eventually, what happened? Happened out on his journey to achieve enlightenment. Did he find success with the Hindu paths? Anybody? Bueller? He did decline material goods. And did that help him achieve moksha? Did he discover his Atman and rejoin Brahman? He achieved Nirvana, that's right. Okay, so his enlightenment happened after he gave up asceticism, right? So he passed out and then was gifted a bowl of rice by a young woman who found him near the river. And so once he helped himself to some food, more than just enough to survive, right? And got himself some shade, right? Not engaging in that extreme ascetic behavior anymore. That is when the process of enlightenment under the Bodhi tree began, which we watched that horrible Keanu Reeves reimagining of it, right? But that process at the end, again, was him facing the illusion of his true self, right? So this ends up being another primary turning point for him away from the Hindu practice. He also ends up being very opposed to the caste system, right? As a result of what he saw before he left. So going back to his birth story, I mentioned there were some lotus leaves that fell under the Bodhi tree when he was achieving enlightenment. And if you recall, it was the same type of tree under which his mother gave birth to him. But again, I forgot to tell you the most interesting part of the story about the immaculate conception part and immaculate birth part. He is said to have been delivered from her side. So he emerged from her side and walked out of her. And every step little baby Buddha took, a lotus flower sprung up under his feet. So that is, there's a picture of that in our PowerPoint. Now, I'm going to interpret the side as like early C-section, but one could interpret it very miraculously as well. Right, so that significance of the lotus flower. It also ends up being significant later on in terms of the three schools of Buddhism, or the first two that break off. One of them ends up focusing primarily on the life that the Buddha led, while the others end up focusing more on the writings and teachings that were documented either by him or by others. And one of the most famous sutras, or supposed speeches that he gave, or sermons, if you will, is called the Lotus Sutra. Have any of you, this is like such a weird reference, but it's always what I think of. Have any of you seen the movie Man in the Moon with Jim Carrey, where he plays the comedian who used to be on SNL? Have any of you ever seen this movie? You know what I'm talking about? All right, so there's a scene in that movie that I think sort of encapsulates this really well, but in a more humoristic sort of way. If we don't get it from what I'm about to tell you, maybe I'll find the clip and you can understand the humorous bit about it. But the Lotus Sutra is one of the most famous because it is a sutra where the Buddha did not actually say anything. He held up a lotus flower, right? And that was the sermon. You might also, another analog of this might be, if you're familiar with John Cage's music, he was a sort of eclectic artist back in the day. He had a very famous piece called 4 minutes and 33 seconds, which he performed in Central Park. And he just went out and sat in front of his piano, and didn't do anything. He didn't play a single note, but let the sounds of nature in the park be the music, right? And so that's sort of what I'm referencing with the silence. So do we all need a little humorous break, little to show us the power of silence? Should we see? Like a pose? Not like a pose. It's actually like a stand-up comedy routine. Are we interested in seeing it? We don't have to play it. You all are so quiet today. Some sort of feedback would be nice. Yes, okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Joseph. All right, so here is an example.
Welcome back to Saturday Night Live, and now, as a special treat on our first show, musical guest, Andy Kaufman.
What's wrong with this guy? This is dead air.
Mr. Trouble never hangs around when he hears this mighty sound. Here I come to save the day. That means the tiny mouse is on the way. Yes, sir, when there is a wrong to right, Mighty Mouse will join the fight. On the sea or on the land, he gets the situation well in hand.
So though we are in danger, we never despair, 'cause we know that where there's danger, he is there.
He is there on the land, on the sea, in the air. We're not worrying at all. We're just listening for his call. Here I come to save the day. That's just the mighty
Okay, who gets it? Who gets why that's funny? Excellent, absolutely, right? And again, I that's a very humorous example, but I think it's analogous to the types of things, these silent moments of meaning represent, right? When they're done in front of a large audience, it's drawing a stark contrast to their expectations, right? So in terms of Buddhism, those expectations, of course, are going to be representative of our attachment to things, right? Our desires for things that are impermanent. So replacing laughter in this case with the Buddha and the lotus, what do you think we might get from the lotus flower in his hand? Could it have been any object in the Buddha's hand? Or is the lotus flower in particular saying something? Could have been anything. Yes, absolutely, right? It's representing that non-attachment. It's a flower, right? Flowers are so fragile, right? I mean, I guess if it had been something less fragile, it might not have been as convincing. So maybe it couldn't have been anything, but yeah, right? It was just supposed to represent the impermanence, right? So he picked a particularly beautiful yet particularly fragile and temporary thing, right? And so this is meant to represent, in Buddhism, the lotus flower represents that path to enlightenment, which we're going to talk about now. All right, so come back to our PowerPoint. All right, is everyone able to see the PowerPoint okay? Yes,
Yeah.
thanks. Great, thank you. Okay, so wrapping up again, right? We, just to review really quickly, we were focusing on Buddhist metaphysics, right, on Tuesday. And so focusing on how the Buddha is elaborating on the Hindu metaphysics we already had of Maya, right? Because there is no Brahman now. So really making sense of how samsara operates and what it means to exist in only a state of impermanence, right? And the implications of that for the self and why there is no sense of enduring permanent true self in Buddhism, like there was in Hinduism. Right, this leads then to Buddhist epistemology, right? The noble truths that we have to accept, right? The things that we should learn as true. The first one is that life is suffering. Again, there's no permanent truth because, again, everything about life is temporary. So even the suffering is temporary. But to exist means that you will at some point suffer, right? And we talked about how that could potentially even be, understood in terms of non-sentient life forms suffering, like plants. Okay, and so then identifying again, as the Buddha did, the source of that suffering, which is not just attachment to Maya, but specifically an attachment to the self, right? We can overcome that suffering then by detaching ourselves from the thing that causes the suffering, but we're not going to be reabsorbed into Brahman, so we're not achieving moksha. Instead, all we're doing is, so we can think of nirvana in Buddhism not as a positive type of enlightenment, but I don't mean negative in a bad way, but negative as in it's taking something away, right? So whereas moksha was we could see it as the adding of something, right? You've shed or shaken off, right, all of the illusions of Maya, and you've rejoined, right? You've come home in a sense to Brahman, right? That whole. There's no add here in Buddhism, right? There's no thing that you're joining, that you're becoming bigger than yourself, right? So it's a takeaway. It's a removal of something. So nirvana literally means, and I'm gonna type this in the chat, literally means to be blown out. Like we would blow out a flame, right? Extinguish. So what are we extinguishing? Your suffering, right? Your attachment. We're extinguishing your contribution to the continuation of samsara, right? So again, it's all understood of in terms of cause and effect. So anything that an enlightened Buddhist does in the world should only have positive cause or effect in the world. If your effect in the world is to contribute more harm and suffering, that is going to be the opposite, right, of a path that leads to nirvana. But since, all we have from the Buddha is this middle way between extremes, that can be difficult to conceptualize. And so we get a more thorough idea of how to achieve nirvana with what he calls the Eightfold Path. Okay, and so this is going to be a sort of step-by-step idea of how we can work towards achieving nirvana. We're going to go through those with some examples so we can get a sense of what that might look like. Okay, so again, the metaphysics leads into their epistemology, the view of knowledge. How do we get the knowledge? Well, we follow the ethics now, right? The way we ought to live our lives. So pausing really quick, any questions about that review before we start with the Eightfold Path? All right, pop them in the chat if you have them. Oh, Joseph, yes.
Is nirvana nothing?
So that is the question, right? So it's not the case that like you just pop out of existence. So you could say it is So this is how the Buddhists would describe it. Oops, I didn't mean to stop sharing, sorry. They would describe it as the death of your ego consciousness, right? So your everything, all your skandhas are still alive, right? They're tied to your physical person. But this notion of the self, this notion of I, has gone away. You've completely eliminated it. Now, what we're going to see in the different schools of Buddhism that come up next week is that we can interpret that different ways, right? We can interpret that as Nirvana is like a moment to moment thing, right? So you can have Nirvana like in a moment and then it could go away, right? Other people might say that like once you achieve it, it's like a way of being, right? Afterwards. Other people will describe it as something which happens after physical death. And so you might be living as what we would call a bodhisattva, right? So someone who has intentionally postponed nirvana so that they can continue to help others. So we're going to see differences of what exactly that means, but it doesn't mean like just popping out of existence, right? So your physical body still continues. What is interesting, though, Joseph, is that is not going to be the case in Taoism. Religious Taoism specifically says that when individuals attain enlightenment, a giant bird takes them up into the mountains. So that's like immediate. All right. So jumping into the Eightfold Path, right? So this is split into 3 categories, and it starts off with the wisdom group, right? So you have to have the right ideas and be on the right, again, sort of path before you can get started. So of course, we're going to see a little bit of repetition here, right? You have to start off with the right view, that is believing the Four Noble Truths. You have to have the right intention, okay, freeing the mind from worldly desires, dishonesty, egoism, and cruelty to all living creatures. So this right away is really difficult, right? People can spend their lifetime just focusing on the second part, working on freeing those minds from your desires, right? Practicing, sort of like faking it until you make it, right? Like practicing doing the thing before you're actually like fully capable of doing it without any effort. So this is all going to require, right, a great amount of effort, but you're trying for the right reasons, right? So this means you're not being like, well, I'm going to become a Buddhist and I'm going to follow the Eightfold Path because I want, 1 million followers on my TikTok, right? Not the right intention. So not going to work out for you. Okay, so after you are in the right headspace to approach the path, right, then you can start working on your actions. Okay, so this is the moral discipline group, focusing on what you say, what you do in individual actions, but also what job you pick. Okay, so you have to make sure that the words that come out of your mouth align with those right intentions, right? Which means refraining from lying, harsh or hurtful language, and even idle talk, right? So these are meant to be things that, again, are seen as causing suffering. Even idle talk definitely can cause suffering. Okay, and then of course, we also want to walk the talk. So the right action must follow. That means, again, acting in ways that do not cause harm, abstaining from killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct. What's interesting about Buddhism, though, is that sexual misconduct is only understood as sexual activity which causes harm. So I was actually just reading this in, I don't need to read you the whole bit, but I can scan it and share it with the class if you're interested. I'm teaching women in world religions right now as well. So we're talking about gender in Buddhism and Buddhist views on sexuality. And the idea that, it's very, very much the case that many Buddhists will say that there's nothing wrong with same-sex sexual relationships. Even though people who join the monastic order are meant to abstain from sexual pleasure, right? The idea is that it's just seen as one of our animal instincts. So it's not inherently good or bad, anything regarding sex. It's only when harm, right, results or is the consequence or suffering results that it becomes worthy of moral judgment. Idle or idle. Idle as in the first one, Sean. Idle, like if you were idling in a car, right? It's stalling everything. It's boring, in other words. Okay, and then the fifth one is really, really important, right? Especially in this, free market, supposedly free market capitalist society we live in, right? The job that you pick, the career, what you do to make a living should also be in line with those values, right? So for example, I'm going to go through an example of this from when I was trying to be vegan, and it was difficult. But there, I paid my way through college, through community college, working at restaurants, and I worked at Outback Steakhouse, right? So, if that had been the time when I was trying to be vegan, like that, working in that place definitely would not have aligned, right, with that sort of values. I was actively participating in the consumption of just ridiculous amounts of meat. It is crazy to me the portion sizes that people would order at that place, like 20-ounce steaks. Okay, not to mention the bloomin' onion. So good, dangerous. It'll kill you right there. But right, so again, even the things that we do to make a living are meant to reflect and support that idea of only having positive contributions to samsara and not contributing to the suffering. How do they make a single onion 300? By covering it in lard, I don't know, and deep frying it. Cover it in all kinds of fat and more fat, and then you dip it in the tasty dip fat, and it's delicious. And oh my gosh, gonna take years off your life. I'm pretty sure that's one of the most unhealthy menu items like in the history of the world, the bloomin' onion. So good though. All right, so after we have potentially, right, hopefully started practicing what we preach, that's when actually the final stages become more inward again. And this is where I want to take a pause and go through that example that I was mentioning that I was going to share, which was my attempt to be vegan, right? So I'll just tell you I'm not a vegan anymore. I definitely try to cut back on meat, but I was vegan for almost a decade, and it was very, very challenging. It was a direct result of my teaching environmental ethics and feeling like a complete hypocrite. Like I couldn't think of any good reasons and was just facing the suffering every day when I was teaching my classes. So yes, but it definitely started off with, right, I came to believe that certain things were true. I came to believe that the way that we consume and produce animal proteins on a massive scale is unethical. I still think that. I'm a little less consistent in my financial support of it, but I still think that that's true, right? That it's harmful for the people who work there. I think it's harmful for the animals, obviously. I think it's really harmful for the environment. And I think it's harmful for us as consumers, right? They don't necessarily produce the best products. So that was the view, right, that I came to. And then I really did have to sort of investigate my intention, because this happened in a stage of my life. Obviously, I was beginning teaching, and I'm surrounded by other like-minded vegans who are definitely not the kind of vegans I want to be, right? Going off on someone for sitting in a leather chair. Like, I didn't want to be an asshole. Right? Like, and I also had to recognize that even the option of opting out of protein, animal proteins, is like super privileged, right? There are many people in parts of the world where the animal protein is the only protein they can get access to. So it would be really privileged and elitist and, Eurocentric of me to be like, well, it's just not right of you to do. And why can't you get your, Beyond Beef like everybody else? Okay, so we want to make sure that we're approaching it for all the right reasons, and I definitely was aware of that, because veganism has not had the greatest PR in the past, and I did not want to be a part of that. So then leading into, again, right, you have to start actually saying the things, and that is really hard. Like being the one at holidays to explain why I'm not participating in eating the meat and why I brought my own food, and having my family members get on me about answering those questions honestly to their kids, because now their kid is all upset about the way animals are treated. It's like, I was just answering their question. I didn't give them any gory details. They asked and I told them. Right? I mean, if someone says, why aren't you eating animals? And you say, because you love them, like, that's not a lie. And that resonates with a lot of children. Right? But again, it can cause problems. And so then, making sure that all of my behavior was in line with that, going vegan or changing your diet at all takes time. It's for whatever reasons you're doing it. There's changes you make at home. There's changes when you go out to eat. There's changes that you have to make when eating with people who have different dietary restrictions than you, right? So all of that can, create some really difficult situations. So for example, one holiday, my mom, I wanted her to make some traditional Jewish food for my partner to let them partake in that. And I love my mom's potato latkes. And so I was asking her to find a vegan recipe. And so she spent all afternoon looking for a vegan recipe for potato latkes. And then we go to the grocery store and she picks out eggs. I was like, Mom, no. But then my mom starts crying in the middle of the grocery store. And I realized that my attempt to be I realized right in that moment, my attempt to be respectful of ethical dietary restrictions of the people participating was conflicting with her desire to be respectful to the history of that recipe, right? She was saying like, I can't, all of these vegan, like they'd look nothing like, the recipe that had been passed down through generations in her family. And I was like, you know what, we'll eat whatever, like it's fine, right? So there's a weighing there that can happen. Okay, so even though most Buddhists are vegetarian or vegan, they too might not observe it all the time, right? There are situations where, there might be a greater suffering in the moment to, hold on to something merely based on principle. So little anecdote it can all go very wrong. It can cause lots of problems. All right, so I mentioned the livelihood one, right? I definitely couldn't have worked it out back steakhouse while doing that. Right effort. Okay, so now getting into the consciousness group. Okay, so this is the difficult part and why I think using veganism is a great example. So even though I had for years mastered steps 1 through 5, this part is the reason why I am no longer vegan. Right? So you have to gain mastery over your evil thoughts. And my goodness, does bacon smell good? And don't you want to eat it every time you smell it? Right? Or a delicious donut or a delicious cupcake or something, right? Something that is terrible for you, that it tempts you and you still want it, even on a subconscious level, even though you know it's wrong, right? And so then, of course, you can start making concessions here and there. So this is where, for me, I got off track, was in step number 7. I was going through a very difficult time in my life. And so I decided that I wanted to give myself the joy of comfort food. And that was more important than, denying myself just little joys, right? But in that case, I don't know that I was giving special attention to every state of my body, mind, and feelings, but I was trying to acknowledge like the whole of my experience there. Okay, and so the idea is eventually you can figure out, right, a balance, a way of, living in that routine or that in line with those values in a way that doesn't, right, cause huge disruptions, which can take a long time, right, lifetime, or if you're a Buddhist, lifetimes, plural. And then, of course, eventually we want to have a sort of concentration so that we're no longer distracted, right, by those things that can take us away. So I have failed to achieve the consciousness group. But again, I do like that as a sort of example as to how one might work their way through the Eightfold Path. So let me ask, have any of you, have you taken steps like this in your life? Just even out of coincidence, they sort of align? Or does this sound like totally ridiculous? Does this make sense? What are our thoughts on the Eightfold Path? Yes, to what, Joseph? Have you done some of this before?
Yeah, when I was in Green River, I was doing computer science because I wanted money and financial security, which is quite opposite of what's going on right now. But I made a decision last year to switch to psychology major, which was a huge go after my heart, not my head. And then my mom was like, go after your heart. And that's when I made the switch.
That's so wonderful. right? And so there too, even though it might be a struggle, right, to follow one's heart in certain situations, the idea is that you will, I'm sure, be much happier for it, even regardless of the challenges. Good, thank you for sharing. Anyone else? Anyone else see anything familiar in these steps, or is anyone having really strong feelings against this path? Seems problematic, doesn't make sense. What are our thoughts? Maxwell, we haven't heard from you. Jordan? Sean? Euler? You guys are probably too young for even me to make that joke. All right. Well, I think that this is a pretty, I mean, maybe not super specific, but rather useful guide. Here we go. Thank you, Maxwell. They seem to make sense generally for life, but I'm assuming that following the path you take it to more extremes than every day. Yeah, again, and the Buddhist path is meant to be the middle path, right? So if you are finding yourself at those extremes, right, that might be an indication that we're no longer in alignment, right? We're maybe straying off the path a little bit. So yeah, maybe if I had really taken a hardcore principled stance on something and totally disregarded, right, everyone's feelings. But yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult to judge in those situations. So we don't have like a super clear indication of what to do. But again, we're trying to become better people, right? People who on the whole are not contributing to suffering in the world. And so, yeah, it might look like extreme in situations where you see monks sweeping every step in front of them that they take. Like that might seem like a really extreme thing to do. They're doing it so that they don't step on any bugs, right? So that they're not contributing to harm in that sense, right? Not trying to kill any living thing. But then I think of, I don't know if any of you ever watched The Simpsons. There's an old episode where Lisa goes vegan and they do this sort of, very extreme, like a level 10 vegan will just take off their clothes and walk into the ocean and just let the ocean take them, right? Like that it is difficult to even exist on this planet without causing harm, right? Yeah, so I mean we have to, it's difficult. So again, a balance, right? You definitely could take it to the extremes and then like nothing we do is permissible. Levels of, yes, exactly. Good. I also think of this in terms of, I don't know if any of you have seen the show The Good Place. It's based on Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophical play No Exit, but there's a lot of utilitarian ethics in there, and they talk about the fact that you're supposed to maximize the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people, but that's just really difficult to do in our society today, right? And they use an example of like someone who bought their mother flowers on Mother's Day. That used to be something that really just had a mostly positive contribution to the world, right? Didn't have many negative consequences, but because of the way, again, capitalism works today, those flowers are being shipped from right underemployed or underpaid workers in other parts of the world and are contributing to climate change and right, who knows how people are being treated where at the store they work, and right, so there's just all these unforeseen, the chemicals, the pesticides, right, like that are used on the flowers. So it's pretty much impossible to exist today without doing that, which is why, right, the monks will extricate themselves from society and live amongst the sangha, the community of practitioners, so that they can minimize that impact as much as possible. Okay, so going back, right, I mentioned that, right, that earlier notion of the self is impermanent and how there are these 5, right, elements that make up who we are. Okay, so we do have a sixth sense in Buddhism, but it's not it's not seeing dead people, right? So they call the mind the sixth sense, right? So they're turning this into a materialistic, right, a physical thing, not an immortal soul, okay, and sort of a bottom up sort of thing, right? So these are where we get our immediate sensory input, okay? These are the corresponding objects that they form in our minds. And right, that ends up constituting over time thoughts and ideas. But again, as soon as this stuff disappears, so does this, according to Buddhism, right? Hence the not self, no underlying permanent reality. And again, the Buddha's argument for this is just that empirical experience he had, right? When he looked inward, he did not experience a single thing that was permanent, right? So personal identity in Buddhism is just a name we give to what they say are the interrelated parts of our psychophysical person, right? So the body and the mind working together. And so they're going to utilize that chariot analogy from Hinduism, right? But really the main idea is that we're no longer talking about the gunas and your Atman as an immortal soul. We're simply talking about these 5 bundles of sensory things, which end up producing our sense of self. So this is where you can see the process of the 5 aggregates working together. You can go through those on your own, right? But the idea is that we have these faculties, they produce a certain sensation, right, in various forms. We then form a perception based on the type of sensation we have. Many perceptions create mental formations, right, which end up creating that thought, those thoughts and ideas, which over time generate patterns of thinking, and that is what we're calling our consciousness, right? It's merely the manifestation of all of these things below it. Okay, so the idea here is that asserting an eternal underlying self, like Hindus did, right, is a form of heresy. Either the self is mortal or immortal. Both concepts create desires and lead to attachment, right? So we have to be willing to accept the impermanence. Don't focus on the mortality, he's saying, though, right? Don't focus on the fact that you're going to die. Just focus on the fact that everything is impermanent and constantly changing, right? And so there's nothing about you as you are now that will survive the physical death of your body, either on its own or collectively. Okay? So that's what it means when the body dies. It's just meaning that your psychophysical person no longer exists. Okay, that thing that made up who you are. So as I mentioned before, if the skandhas are impermanent, then what survives death and is reborn? And we sort of talked about this at the end of class last time. We talked about the monkeys, right? So again, if it's not any soul or enduring mind, it's not the skandhas. There's only one thing that is left, and that is the karma. Okay, so it's really like karmic energy that creates the conditions which set up the next life. So we really can think of karma in Buddhism as cause and effect, right? So there are certain events that happened in a previous life form that are going to create the basis of a personality for what's to come. And so it's not that the personality is transferring, right? But it's more like a spark, right? That is igniting the ones to follow. And again, we might think of this as just being a very literal description of how we come into the world, right? We are contingent upon beings who came before us. And if we had been born in another place or at another time, we would probably be different, right? So it's it's that ripple effect. And so it's not nothing, right? But there isn't anything that is like moving from one ripple to the other. Another metaphor that they're going to use is matches, right? So again, if achieving nirvana is to be blown out, you can think of karma as striking the match and lighting it, right? So if you were to use one lit match to light another, right, that flame is sparking the next match, but it's not like anything from the first match is moving to the second match, right? So we can think of it that way, right? The initial sparks to set it up, not anything moving from one to the next. Right, and then again, how is that fair? Well, we don't have to stay where we are, right? Was the story of the monkeys. So a little cartoon version of that here. Okay, so again, The goal then is to detach ourselves from this sense of self, right? We don't need to have a true self in order to overcome suffering. We do not need to live forever, okay? And so it's not non-existence, right? We're not just ceasing to exist, but it is, again, just an annihilation of that sense of self, right? Of your desires or craving to have a permanent self, right? So, again, I think of really silly examples about this, but I know it's like mostly guys in our class, but surely you all have heard of or seen the show America's Next Top Model. Do you remember, like, Tyra Banks? People trying to be models. Does this sound at all familiar? Yes. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So I haven't watched the show in a million years. I don't even know if the show is still on, but one of the things that I remember from when it was a big hit was there was always some model whose hair, women socially get a lot of confidence from our hair. It's given a lot of social value. There's always a woman who gets her hair cut really short and she loses her shit, right? Why do people get so upset when they get a bad haircut? I mean, it's a haircut. Our hair grows back. Why do we get so upset about things like that? Makes you feel like you're not good looking, right? So again, if you're taking a lot of self-worth from that. Do any of you identify with your hair? No? So you guys could like lose your hair tomorrow and you'd be okay. You don't want to, exactly. Yeah, right? Oh, Victor, you have a story. Do you want to share? And do you feel like a different person with long hair?
Yes.
The way we present ourselves to the world, or even at home with ourselves, it really affects our sense of self, right? So it's really easy to say, right, that we shouldn't identify with this physical body and all the experience that it gives us, but it's really difficult to do. And it's, you can't just lose an arm or lose a part of your body and not have it totally change your sense of self, right? But the idea is that is all the result of suffering, because that arm has been changing your whole life, right? Or your hair has been changing your whole life. Even if you identify with it now, it's not the same as what it was, right? It's already changing already. Okay, and so trying to get over this is supposed to be the thing that we aim to achieve. And then again, there's no Brahman to be reabsorbed into, so it will just mean that we are no longer reincarnated into samsara. But again, that's going to differ a little bit depending upon which branch of Buddhism we look at next. All right, so in our last few minutes, finish up this PowerPoint. Okay, yes, mentioned all of that. Can be achieved during this life. Yes, so if it is said to happen temporarily or even permanently, you can see it as a meditative trance, right? So a sort of state that someone is in. They could be in a nirvana trance. It could just be a state of peace that they sort of carry with them all the time. Or it can be something like a union with pure, just the reality of, this makes me feel like you're like the person who sees the Matrix, right? Not union with Brahman, but like the person who really sees how temporary everything is. Okay, so upon physical death, nirvana just means release from samsara, escape from that bondage, and no rebirth. So then we have, again, as we're going to see in different schools of Buddhism, there are going to be different types of nirvana. So right away, we can have complete nirvana or incomplete nirvana, right? Anything is complete means that your physical body has died. Okay, and so the only one that is said to have achieved complete nirvana while alive is the Buddha, right? He is said to have had access to all of his previous life memories. And that is not something that all Buddhas have. Incomplete nirvana is much more common to have been attributed to individuals, right? Those sort of temporary states or even permanent, but just ways of being in the world. So again, the two major schools that we're going to start looking at next week are the Theravada tradition, okay, and the Mahayana tradition. And so one of the biggest distinctions between them are going to be their different metaphysics in terms of nirvana, right? Does nirvana mean leaving Maya and samsara, or does it mean staying in it? Okay, and so the Theravada tradition is going to see it as a separate state, whereas the Mahayana tradition is going to see them as merged. They're also going to have very specific ideas about how many times you have to be reincarnated to achieve nirvana. But since it's the end of class, I'm going to let you take a look at these last couple slides on your own. And then the last slide is just that final overall comparison between Hinduism and Buddhism. All right. So next week, we do not have class on Tuesday because it's advising day. I will add a special Zoom link. But we will pick, so you can drop in if you want on Tuesday, but otherwise I will see you next Thursday, where we will be talking about Confucianism. We're going to start moving over, oh, sorry, no, we're finishing Buddhism. That's not too far. So we'll be talking about the different schools of Buddhism next week. Yes. All right. Hang out if you have any questions. Otherwise, have a wonderful weekend.